Coming up, the two schools of psychology behind personality theory. That's psychoanalysis and behaviorism, the two big types of test, behavioral versus traditional. Or you can think of it as structured versus unstructured. Simple, right? No such luck. Wait to see what we've got in store. So, personality tests. Oh yeah, this is the one that's going to get you invited to parties. This is the stuff where people think we know more about a person than they know about themselves. Where we can read people and predict how they'll behave. Well, that's what we'd like people to think anyway. Now, this material is in chapters 8 and 9 out of your textbook. Don't worry if you're watching all of these videos in sequence. We haven't skipped chapter 7. We're just going to go and do chapter 7 in our next theme, which is theme 4. Now, I'm going to start off with a link to a TED talk on personality. Okay, wouldn't be a proper teaching session, would it, if we didn't have a link to a TED talk? What I'm not going to do is show you the whole of the TED talk. I'm only going to show you just a little clip of it. Because we haven't got time, because I want to make this a short video for you. But you can have a look at the TED Talk in your own time. I think it's worth watching. The guy's kind of funny and kind of explains things quite well. I like the video anyway. Seems a nice chap. Made me laugh in places.
And watching you interact with each other. And I think it's fair to say already that there are 47 people in this audience, at this moment, displaying psychological symptoms I would like to discuss today. And I thought you might like to know who you are. But instead of pointing at you, which would be gratuitous and intrusive, I thought I would tell you a few facts and stories in which you may catch a glimpse of yourself.
Now, here's a nice quote for you from the video. You're like some other people and like no other people. That's Brian Little said that in the video. Oh, by the way, what does that mean? Well, it means it's a bit of a conundrum. It's an ambiguity. We are the same and different from other people. We're both alike and alike everyone else. Profound, eh? Now, in psychology, we have a whole field dedicated to this topic of personality. It's called personality psychology. No, it's not psychology with a personality, it's personality psychology. Personality testing is just a small bit of personality psychology, although hundreds of personality tests are in existence. Don't worry, we're not going to cover them all in this video. I'm just going to give you a way of thinking about them all. Now, get ready to groan. You ready? Psychology has found that personality is inherently difficult to define, and we still don't really know what it is. There you go. Sorry about that, but we can't yet tell you what it is. But some people in psychology think we have found enough consistency between individuals and enough of a degree of distinction between individuals, their responses to assessment, to sustain a whole field in this practice, in this particular area. Now, one of the big schools of psychology behind all of this in the early days was psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was the dominant school in psychology from around the early 1900s to around about the 1920s. But it's still going strong today, but you can kind of say that generally in psychology it's kind of derided, really. Well, it's certainly seen as unscientific by a lot of people, and it has largely fallen out of favour. Now, of course, a key figure here is good old Uncle Sigmund Freud. And key to the approach of psychoanalysis is the concept of the unconscious, that we have desires, drives, and instincts that we are not conscious of, but that influence how we behave. For psychology to understand what makes a person tick, we need to find a way of accessing the unconscious. Now, that's a tough gig because we can't observe the unconscious directly. And this is where projective tests come in. Projective tests use a set of unstructured and ambiguous stimuli to create access to those unconscious drives and desires and instincts that are seen to form the root of our personalities. The responses to those stimuli are then interpreted in a way that infers the individual's personality, through creating an insight into the person's needs, motives, and conflicts. Projective techniques come in forms which, broadly speaking, sit into one of 5 categories. And these are association techniques. These are the ink blot tests and word tests. Construction techniques. These are story tests or sequences tests. Completion techniques. These are sentences or stories again. And arrangement selection. This is not going to be covered by us much because it's rarely used. And expression techniques, drawings or play. So let's get to it then. The one projective technique that you all probably know because it's become legendary, really, particularly if you're a fan of the Watchmen graphic novel and the movie of the same name. And the test you probably thought of when I said ink blot is, yep, you guessed it, the Rorschach ink blot test. This is a test that's controversial, it's been widely critiqued, and people now, particularly in psychology, now treat it with a lot of suspicion. It was first developed in the early 1900s and comprises of 10 ink blots, which are close to symmetrical images or shapes. 5 are black or grey, shades of grey, and the other 5 are in colour. And you show the pictures to the client and ask them what they see. The test can be used with children, but most commonly it's used in adults. There are also a number of other projective techniques like the sentence completion tests. Here you provide the beginning of a sentence and your client completes the sentence. For example, there's the Rotter incomplete sentence test that's described in our prescribed text. Now, just a tip, please don't turn your essays into an extended Rotter incomplete sentence test for me, by writing incomplete sentences. Whilst it would be lovely to use your essay to infer, for you to use to infer my personality when you get my feedback, that's not really the point of the essay. So make sure you get your essays proofread. They're due in week 10. So don't panic if you're viewing this in you should be viewing this in week 8, maybe. No, week 7, I think, perhaps, if you're on track, working at the pace that the unit is intended to be delivered at, because, some of you will be running a bit quicker. If you're running a bit slower, then watch out for the essay, because it's coming up soon. Okay, so enough about the essay. Just make sure you proofread it. Now, I'm going to put together a little video about writing a good essay. I'll put that up online as soon as I can. Now, we also have construction tests. So here, rather than complete a sentence, the client constructs a story, and the most well-known is the thematic apperception test. Why do they make these things so difficult to say? Here we have a series of black and white images that are used. The client is presented with these images, and they're asked to tell the story. Another test is the picture projective test. That has more specific criteria in terms of there's less room for the clinician to exercise their interpretations, a bit more structured. Again, just read more about these tests in your text. Now, with that last test, I say fewer problems with loose interpretations because all of these projective tests I mention in this section are seen as quite subjective, and that's why they're not in favour by some in psychology. Now, to the next series of these are expression techniques. I have difficulty expressing myself talking about expression techniques. Here we go. So expression techniques. Now, an example is asking a client to draw a person. Where they draw a person. It's called the draw a person test, well named, I think you'd agree. So the client is asked to draw a person, then tell a story about the person that they have drawn. And again, it relies on the subjective judgment of the psychologist to read into that story, an interpretation of things that are motivating the client, insights into their personality, what makes them tick. A variant of this is also the drawing test, which is called the house person tree test. And you might have guessed it, you ask the client to draw a house, a tree, and a person, and to talk about their drawing. So all of these tests, you ask the client to talk about their drawing or the image that you put in front of them, and so on. And from the client's responses, you interpret their underlying motives, emotions, and so on. Now, is that okay? Is that what psychology should be doing? Have a think about that. Now, these tests are often, as with many projective techniques, used as a support alongside a clinical interview. They're not seen as great for reliability and validity. Now, what do you think about these tests? Too subjective? Do you think they're unscientific? If they're unscientific, why are they still popular? Also remember, never use the Rorschach test unless you have a German accent or an Austrian accent, not Australian accent, Austrian accent.
Well, that's easy for you to say.
That's a joke. Don't be racist. Now, let's have a look at some other personality theory aside from psychoanalysis. Let's have a quick look at type theories of personality. Now, this stuff preceded psychoanalysis, and it can be traced back to ancient Greece and the time of Hippocrates, who identified four personality types.
Socrates. Now what? I don't know. Philosophize with him.
Actually, let's not talk about the ancient Greeks, eh? It was a long, long time ago, get over it. And actually, it was well before there was such a thing as psychology. Psychology is not really a thing till the mid-19th century. And psychology often claims to makes these grand claims to a history that stretches back to the times of the original philosophers in ancient Greek. And it does it often to make itself feel grown up. And we're actually a very, very young discipline. Also, be aware the whole trait theory stuff is really simplistic, so it can't be proper science, can it? What do you think? Now, one of these type theories that became quite popular and has actually stuck around even though psychology has wanted to kind of bury it, a lot of psychologists have kind of wanted to bury it because it's so simplistic, is the type A personality. This became a very widely known theory in the 1980s. Type A personality was not one you really wanted to be because those guys were at greater risk of having a heart attack. Those guys were seen as insecure, had a desire to dominate others, were aggressive and hostile, very competitive, and generally didn't care about those they put themselves in competition with. So kind of not very nice people, really. So people didn't mind so much that these people were prone to having a heart attack. Those were the type A people, the aggressive people. Now, type B people were less prone to heart attack, and these people tended to be relaxed, easygoing, and non-competitive. Now, research eventually showed only a weak relationship between personality and type A and risk of heart attack. The research has sort of bounced around a bit, either supporting the theory or refuting it or partly supporting it and so on. The theory that type A exists and that type A personalities have prone to heart attack. All of this is all been bounced around. And as I said, it's kind of really viewed as a bit simplistic these days. Can you think of reasons other than personality type that might make competitive people more prone to a heart attack? Have a think about that. if you come up with some reasons, that will give you a pointer to how this whole theory about type A is a bit too simplistic. Now, the theory of type A personality is pretty firmly stuck in the public's imagination. And some might say that the underlying ethos of it, is that it basically tells us it pays to be a nice guy. And that might actually sit behind the theory, and you could go a bit further and say, well, the theory is actually prescriptive rather than descriptive. It aims to encourage a particular set of behaviors rather than describe a particular set of behaviors, as encouraging more people to be type B. And some people say psychology does this a lot. It prescribes, it tells us what we ought to be rather than what we are. Now, the theory of type A personality dropped out of popularity in psychology in the 1990s. Why do you think that happened? Well, one idea is that in the 1980s, early 1990s, social norms shifted and the hyper-competitive, aggressive male became valued by Western societies. Now, you can see an early critique of this shift in social norms in the movie Wall Street, directed by Oliver Stone. The movie attempted to tear down that hyper-masculinized role model, as well as critique the broader direction that society was moving in those days. Well, some people say it's still moving in that direction now.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Okay, now I'm going to skip over phenomenological theories of personality. We're going to skip over that, not just because I can't pronounce it, but because and I'm not skipping over it because it's unimportant. I just want to get to another area of personality theory that contrasts quite starkly with the psychoanalytic theories and with the techniques used by psychoanalysis, like projective techniques. Well, I would really encourage you to read up on the phenomenological theories of personality, particularly Rogerian approaches and the Q sorting task, because that is really quite popular and it's got a lot going for it. I'm moving on in this video because of time, really, and because this next area, as I said, sits in such contrast with psychoanalysis. It might give you a good understanding of the kind of things that are going on in the field of psychological testing. Now, whereas psychoanalysis sought to delve deeper and deeper into our consciousness or into our unconscious, this next school decided not to look there at all. In fact, to leave the subjective experience completely off the radar and instead look at observed behavior. This was the school of behaviorism. Now, here we have behavioral and social learning theories. These theories are grounded in the laboratory work of behaviorism. Skinner and his lovely pigeons. Psychoanalysis was really part of a tradition in psychology that we can see in intelligence testing and again in personality testing. This is where we make inferences of a characteristic or a trait, an attribute. It's something that we can't directly observe, but we infer it or hypothesize it. We say that we can't see it, but we imagine it is there. And then through imagining it being there, use that concept to predict behavior. Now, if the construct we've imagined turns out to be useful to predict behavior, the construct is seen as useful and meaningful and then becomes a thing. So intelligence is just an inferred state. We can't actually see it. It's just a concept, but it's now become a thing because people think of it almost like a physical thing, because psychologists have said that this idea, this concept of intelligence does help us to understand people's behavior. So it's become a thing and people kind of almost think of it as a physical thing. And some psychologists try to convince us that it is a physical thing because they say that they can locate it in the physical structure of the brain. Now, whereas traditional tests of personality, by the way, those psychologists will say they're right. I'm just asking you to put a big question mark all over it, but they're saying they're right. Don't believe it to be right or wrong. You kind of question it. Make your own mind up at the end of your degree whether those guys are right or wrong. Actually, give yourself a bit longer. Take a bit of time out. Don't commit yourself to a perspective just yet. Keep your minds open on this stuff. Now, tests of personality involve the assessment of hypothesized personality constructs, which in turn are used to predict overt behavior. Behavioral approaches are quite a departure from this. These approaches fail to acknowledge anything that could not be directly measured. So thoughts, emotions, desires, and so on that psychoanalysis looked at, well, these things can't be directly observed. So for behaviorism, they're just ignored. Rather, what was concentrated on was behavior that could be directly observed. And behaviorism was the dominant school in psychology from the 1920s, when it supplanted psychoanalysis, and it was dominant till around about the 1970s, after which it was replaced by cognitivism. There are two other key things to remember with behavioral theories. The first is the assumption that all behavior is learned and that our behavior is determined by our environment. So to understand someone's personality, you need first to recognize that it's learned behavior. And to understand personality, you have to understand the person's environmental context and their learning history. You know, the experiences they've had that they've learned from that has shaped their personality. Now, this later developed into social learning theory that did actually take account, of cognitions, the stuff you cannot directly see. This occurred at the time when cognitivism was on the rise and behaviorism was trying to survive by bending a little, taking into account things that couldn't be observed, cognitions, thoughts. You can't directly observe a thought, but you can see thoughts indirectly because people talk about their thoughts, like I'm doing just now. But you can't read my thoughts. I think you can't read my thoughts unless you're an extraordinary psychologist, the one psychologist who can actually read people's minds. If you are you're probably the only psychologist. If you can read people's minds, don't tell me. I'd rather not know. Okay. Now, one of the most popular theories in this area of behavior theory is Rotter's internal-external scale, which is used to determine the locus of control. Here, it's people's beliefs. So this is the social learning stuff. It's people's beliefs about the source of things that happen to them that is important. So it is taken into account cognitions. So if you did poorly on our first online quiz, do you blame the quiz or do you blame yourself? Here the focus is very much on beliefs, not just on behaviors. Now, the influence of behaviorism on psychology is marked. It was the point at which psychology became fully dominated by the experimental method, the lab reports, that we continue to train psychology students in today. Lab reports and the experimental method is largely an artifact of behaviorism and the school of behaviorism, that influence over psychology. The experimental approach. Also, the emphasis on quantitative methods. This is an artifact of behaviorism as well. Now, qualitative methods are now starting to become more influential in the discipline of psychology, but for a long time they weren't. They were influential in the early days through psychoanalysis, but when behaviorism dominated, those methods became sidelined. Now, here's a link. There is a link between psychoanalysis and the marginalization of qualitative methods in psychology. Now, you might want to think about that a little more. Think about why that happened. Answers on a postcard, or better still, post your thoughts on our Moodle discussion forum. Why are qualitative methods associated with psychoanalysis? And why did qualitative methods die out? And maybe why are they coming back? Why are they starting to become more influential in psychology now? Those are big, deep thoughts. So don't worry if you can't face thinking about that stuff now. You don't need to think about it for this unit, but it might be something interesting for you to think about when you have time. Now, this legacy of behaviorism is also seen in the dominance of structured over unstructured personality tests. The unstructured tests are those like the Rorschach test, completion tasks, and so on, where the response of the participant is open and has to be subjectively interpreted by the clinician. The focus of structured tests is on objectivity, encourages closed responses from the client that can easily be turned into numbers that can then be analysed through statistical procedures. It's a mathematical analysis, not a social analysis, that takes place. Now, there are a whole range of personality tests, and the prescribed text nicely details them and organises them into structured and unstructured tests. This all happens in Chapter 8. Chapter 8 also goes on to break down those structured tests into 3 categories: those driven by theory, those driven by method. Guess which method? Yeah, you guessed it. Good old factor analysis, the F word. Finally, it also breaks down those tests that are driven by criteria. These are called criterion-keyed tests. Ones that I think that would be particularly interesting for you regarding the latter, the criterion-driven test, reference test, is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is because it's become a very popular and widely used test. Knowing about this test is perhaps less important for your assessments on this unit, but more important for your identity as a psychologist, because it's more than likely that someone will mention that test in some way or another, and you're either going to have to fake it or read up about it if you want to engage in a conversation about it. Well, that's enough from me. So I'm not going to go into all those tests that are detailed in Chapter 8, but I do have a read of them, so you get an understanding of the range of tests that are used. There's a lot of different tests. Some of them I think you'll find quite interesting. Chapter 9 we're not covering here, but I would encourage you to read that Chapter 2, because it looks at how psychological testing has shifted focus a little bit, not just to look at people's deficits, but to look at people's assets. Is that the right word? The good stuff that people can do. Now, that's enough from me, particularly for this episode. Actually, that's enough from me for Theme 3. We've finished our recorded lectures for this theme, and next we move on to Theme 4, Children, Culture and Vulnerability. So I shall see you soon. Ta-da!